their action plans for how to help someone in crisis or someone needing intervention, or even a community or a family needing prevention services might actually be oppressing what's actually most helpful. And so there's a lot of work through some local people who would talk about that, and not only talk about that at the meetings, but would also meet with people here at AVCP, including myself. And I had already been exposed to the idea of undoing racism through my workings with the State Office of Children's Services and the Tribal State Collaboration Group that meets a number of tribal organizations, and the OCS meet 3 times a year and talk about a lot of the issues with child welfare, especially revolving around the disparity in the high numbers of Native children in custody and state custody. And so there was a number of people who go to those meetings who have been to undoing racism, and there was one person who was actually a trainer. And so just by going to those meetings, I learned a little bit about it, and it seemed to fit with some of the conversations that happened during those planning meetings. And so it was brought up as an idea, well, maybe this is where we need to start. Maybe we need to take several steps back and look at what is causing domestic violence and sexual assault, the high numbers that are happening and happen, along with the high numbers of substance abuse and suicide and a lot of other social ills, I guess, that people tend to get treated through various treatment options, but never looking back at, what is it about the systems themselves that are causing those disparities. And so it was brought up to the group that maybe this was a good idea, and no one in the meeting group had ever been to a training. And so it was kind of on trust and faith in the people that, I knew and other people knew, and their experiences with the workshop and the analysis that the workshop presents and how it has helped them first personally, because people talk more personally about how the training affects them first, and then how it affects the work that they do. But I think it was kind of understood that, race and racism is something that needs to be addressed in the services and the way that we provide prevention services in our region. And so I think most people were on board with agreeing to bringing it to Bethel through those initial planning stages, and that's kind of where we started. And we thought, if there is a root cause, that would be probably one of the main root causes. Michelle, do you want to add anything?
I guess this is Michelle DeWitt, and I'm with Tender Women's Coalition, and I guess I would add, or maybe bring out a little bit to what Cheryl said, that there was a lot of consensus amongst the group at the table about root causes in our region related to violence, abuse, substance abuse, suicide, all of these problems. And we all agreed that in order to design any kind of prevention approaches or strategies or work, what projects are being funded or things like that, that we needed to address the true roots, the true root causes, and the group all agreed through that consensus decision making that racism, oppression, historical trauma, those are the root causes of how the numbers in our region for these kinds of problems got to where they are today. And I think that was, identifying that early on as a prevention group set the framework for everyone's, ability to take that leap of faith to host this workshop, since people hadn't been before, and kind of set up this a framework that all strategies then from. That's okay. That's all.
Okay. I was wondering if both of you perhaps could describe for us what an undoing racism workshop is actually like. Perhaps some of the core pieces, the length and time, the general approach, and this can be for both of you.
Okay. I can start, Michelle, if you want to add anything. The first trainings that we held, or workshops we held in Bethel, we planned for 2.5 days, back to back, so a full week. And the trainers and the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond, which is the agency that owns Undoing Racism, and its workshop, usually recommend 2.5 days for a training and limit the amount of people to 30 to 40 max. And so we did that, and what we found after that week was that maybe 2.5 days wasn't long enough, and 3 days would be better. And so since then we've had them for 3-day trainings, which works a lot better. But they usually start, there's usually 3 trainers, and they like to have people from different racial backgrounds, and then they make sure that they have one person who kind of represents the racial background that is kind of the majority of the region. And so for us, that would be American Indian or Alaska Native. And so there's usually 3 trainers and from 3 different backgrounds, and then they go through. They agree to a contract. As a lot of people have been through trainings, you agree to how things are going to work in the room with the group of people that you're with. And one of the key things, if you're going to host a training or go to one, is to commit to being there for the full 2.5 days or 3 days or however you plan it, because it doesn't work if people are going to come and then leave for an hour to do some work and come back. They have to be in the room the whole time. And then they go through the history of the People's Institute and who they are, and then there's some introductions. And then one of the key things is to kind of push people to think in different ways, and to understand how we've all been socialized through schooling and just what we think are normal ways to raise children in America today. And so the first day is just kind of getting to know what the workshop is about, and moving toward. There is really no discussion of race on the first day, if I can remember that right. Maybe, do you remember, Michelle?
I think maybe they get into just some really basic definitions, but very little.
Yeah, very little. And one of the key questions, I think I could share this without giving away too much about the workshop, and it's something, everyone on the line could maybe take back with them and think about where they would ask this question and how they would answer if they were asked. And I think it's an important question. And it seems simple, but it becomes a little bit complicated. The question is, why are people poor? And they spend a lot of time on kind of building a background or building a foundation for sharing their analysis and their definition. And I can't say too much because they don't like people to share the key pieces of their workshop. And I guess you could go online and look. There's lots of people who talk about it. But I wouldn't feel comfortable sharing exactly what was said and what the definition is and all of the key aspects of it, because you have to kind of go through the whole 2 to 3 days to get the bigger picture for yourself. But it's the people that you're with in the room, you learn about, and I think one of the other key things is they really stress, and it's hard throughout the workshop for a lot of people, is not to personalize racism. That's not what the training is about. And the trainers are really good about like depersonalizing racism and really addressing how it manifests and it has built itself in our country through a lot of history that they share and some tidbits on research that they each might bring to the table. And the trainers themselves each have their own strengths and their own, they all, usually most of them all work at different jobs, and so they bring their own research and things that they have done as trainers, which makes every training a little bit different. So if you go to one, it doesn't mean the next one is going to be exactly the same, although all the core elements will be there. And there is time. People sit in a circle. There are no tables. It's one giant circle or oval, and the trainers are part of the circle. And so people aren't divided, and everyone is welcome to share and ask questions.
So Cheryl, this is Laurie. How did you and the Prevention Coalition there decide who to invite to the Undoing workshop?
Well, the initial 2 workshops were almost everyone who was part of the planning meetings and the grant application meetings to get the Governor's Initiative grant. And then their people, their staff or their coworkers also became part of that. And so a lot of agencies really bought in to making sure that they had a good number of staff there. That included, TWC and OCS, the public health nurses, the local school districts, social workers. And so just making sure we got buy-in from the people at the grant planning table, and that just kind of led to their either coworkers or their own staff. And so it wasn't hard for us to fill the room. The invites were kind of informal, those first 2 trainings. And we filled the room. I think there was 75 to 80 people there. But we also invited you, Lori, and Diane Casto as part of our, connected to the grant and the work that we were all doing, just to make sure that we had some support at the state level and the funding level. And so I think it was important to invite people that were already ready to go to it and weren't resisting a workshop called Undoing Racism.
Great.
And Michelle?
I would add, to add to what Cheryl said, the first couple of trainings, as she mentioned, where a lot of folks who were from Bethel and agencies that have been part of the prevention work and, funders and state folks and things like that. And then after that, through the discussions at the South Moon Prevention Group meetings, just how so many opportunities happen for folks here in our hub community. And a lot of the training and the opportunities that we get to participate in workshops or other things happen for the same group of people over and over again, and most of them happen to be here in this hub community. And so a real intentional effort, I think, went out, especially from Cheryl, after the first, few trainings, to extend that invitation out to folks from the villages of our region. And that was really important, and I think that the Undoing Racism workshop provided a lot of framework for some of those discussions, because it allowed us to talk about who has access in a way that all of us understood, because we'd been through the workshop. And the folks who have access to many things are not always the folks who, they're often the same folks, and they're not always the folks who need or deserve those opportunities. So we were able to become more intentional, I think, with future workshops about being more inclusive of folks from the villages.
Cool.
Mm-hmm. And for us, that meant most of the ICWA workers. And I just saw a question here I'll quickly answer, where the trainers are from. There's trainers all over the world. And the 3 trainers, we've had 5 or 6 different trainers now, because we've had 5 or 6 different trainings. There's one lady from Louisiana and one from North Carolina. There's a gentleman from Minnesota, and another lady that came just recently from Minnesota. And I think the last round there was also a trainer from Seattle and maybe one trainer from the East Coast, but I don't remember now which state. And so there are trainers all across the United States. And there was a trainer here in Alaska, but he's since moved to Colorado. So they're from all over. And one of the things that Michelle was saying, we have reached out to the villages. So most of my ICWA workers in the villages have been to the training. But we've also, included some of for my department, we have parents who are on our ICWA caseload, or they're also on the OCS caseload. And so they're parents with children in custody. And so we've also included some of them. And they really have it. The ones who have gone have really engaged in that training and have asked to come back.
Cool.
And so I think, it's important to kind of reach out. And since there's been 5 trainings in Bethel since we've started, and after you get to like the 3rd training you've had, it's almost really easy to get people into the room, because you just ask the people who've already been to invite people for you.
Great.
I think the other thing that I would mention, too, is we made an effort at a number of the workshops to include youth, and it was a really positive thing. And the youth also fully engaged in, the 3 days of the workshops. And some of those youth who were youth from villages who had participated in some of the other prevention strategies that the group had worked on, and some were Bethel youth.
The other thing I would add is for all of the trainings that we had prior to this past fall, most of the participants would be women, just like in almost every, child welfare meeting or domestic violence meeting. Most of the majority of the participants would be women, and there would be very few men participating. Out of 40, there might be 4 or 5. And so we thought that was an important thing to try to figure out how to include more men, because it was one of the goals of our grant, not to include them necessarily in the workshop itself, but in all of our activities. And so just this past fall, we decided to hold just one training specifically for men, and so only men were in the room. And we had men who've been through the training invite men that they knew and call them, and even just inviting people with an invitation that says for a workshop for men. And we brought in, I think there was about 30 men who registered weather and other things. There was about 25 who actually made it and were able to come in from the villages and other agencies for the training. And so that was pretty. It was a good improvement over the only 4 or 5.
Great.
Thanks. Another question is that I understand that much of the anti-racism or undoing racism workshop was funded through the Governor's Initiative Rural Prevention Pilot Projects, which focus on ending violence. Can you both talk a little bit about how this workshop or what the workshop has to do with ending violence, domestic violence and sexual assault in your community, or how that's played out for folks attending the workshop?
Cheryl, you want to go first or me?
You could go first this time.
I think the connection between racism, oppression, and historical trauma and abuse, violence against women and abuse, is not always clear to people. But for our group, I think, or at least through our conversations, by the end, it's very clear to all of us. If it wasn't clear to some group members going into those meetings, it was certainly clear at the end. So I'll speak to this twofold. One is anything we do to try to help folks who are experiencing abuse, or to try to do, to help with a prevention activity, is simply a Band-Aid, and at times it might be a helpful one, and at other times it might be a harmful one. If we are unable to clearly understand how we got where we got, and how did we get here, and the disruptions that happened in the YK region here that created people who were oppressed, who had a dominant culture imposed, who had children taken and forced into boarding schools. All of these things that we hear about cause such a great disruption. And that disruption has led, as it has done over and over again through colonialism, to a number of social problems. And so, if we're not clear on that history and what that disruption still causes today, that it's not just history that happened in the past, that it's acted out even today over and over and over again. If we don't have that clear understanding as people in prevention work, that happened, that people are still harmed by what happened in the past and are still being harmed on a daily basis by organizations and institutions that are trying to be helpful, but in fact are applying those same disruptive policies or rules or whatever it is on folks, then we're never going to be able to actually change the disparities to prevent violence the way that we want to. That harm will continue to be perpetuated. And so I would say, for our prevention group and the work that we're doing, it's been critical that everybody at the table understands that this isn't a murky cause and effect or a sort of semi-related cause and effect. It's a direct cause and effect relationship. So that's what I have to say.
Thanks, Michelle.
Then this is Cheryl, and I agree with everything Michelle has said. And even in the training, at some point, one of the trainers, mentioned about anger management, and that anger management as it is provided today doesn't work for people of color. And there's, now I can't remember who did the research, but there was someone who did some research on why it doesn't work. And just as Michelle was saying, the racism as it is defined in the workshop, and hopefully everyone who goes through that workshop leaves with a pretty good understanding of what that definition is and what it means in the work that we do and the data that we have. And it's a really good and important piece when you're talking with other people to know that they have been to the workshop and understand the same definition that you do. And that, racism and racial oppression and the historical trauma that continues today has created an anger or violence in some people, a reaction that an anger management class or counseling session cannot really fix. And just understanding that when you are working with people of color or for people of color or are a person of color, and knowing that and having a better and clearer path of what is going to work and maybe what isn't going to work and why, and how to explain that, especially in situations where there are people who have more power to affect individuals than you do. Maybe you're just there to advocate or recommend, but you don't have the final decision-making power as maybe a judge would or a doctor, and being able to say the right thing so that maybe they can understand and rethink their decision before either more harm is done or maybe something else is just added on to someone's case plan that doesn't really need to be there.
Great. So I know that a lot of these concepts are really, deep and personal. And then I'm also wondering, outside of that group process, how did this translate back into your organizations and kind of influence the work that you were doing in your organizations or in your partner organizations?
Cheryl, you want to take this one first, or you want me to?
I could try. Let's see. Well, it's an ongoing process, so things are changing as they need to, hopefully, and it takes time to think about your own internal policies and procedures, or maybe your own perceptions of what was happening that maybe wasn't happening, and it causes you to rethink decisions that you're going to make, especially in a role as a director or someone who supervises people. Is that decision based on just what has always been done and you have to do it, or what is the best decision? How are you coming to make that? And so it causes me to think through things a little bit more in depth. One of the things I know we instituted for one of our programs where we bring in families that are either involved in child welfare or at risk of being involved. And a lot of times when they come into Bethel, and they come in for one of our programs called Healthy Families, the Yupik Way, and it's like a 3-day program. And sometimes people do things, especially in hub communities, that they might drink or do things that aren't healthy. And normally, the recommendations we would have gotten from OCS and even from some people within our agency was that they need to be sent home. They have to buy their own way home. They cannot travel under ABCP again. Basically, penalizing them for a mistake that they made. And so one of the things that we changed was, we know people, there's a likelihood that people are going to make a mistake when they come into Bethel for whatever reason. And if we're funding it through a grant, we make sure that we connect with them, whether they get to the training or not. Someone is able to connect with them, but they're not penalized, and we just make sure that they get home and they're welcome back to Healthy Families anytime they're ready. And so we don't shut that door on them where normally, and we still have gotten recommendations that maybe you shouldn't allow them to travel. And usually when we've implemented this, the people are disappointed in themselves and they're very sorry, and they usually don't do it again. And if they do come back, then they participate. And so I think that's one of the little things we changed.
Great. So I want to, there's a couple more questions we have, but I also see that time is rolling along. So if folks want to type in your questions in the chat box, or you can raise your hand if you want to, and you all can ask questions to Michelle and Cheryl. And we can see if there are any questions from folks that are listening in. And in the meantime, while people are doing that, I'm wondering if you could share just a little bit about how it's impacted you personally by going through the Undoing Racism workshops, or what you personally took away from the workshops.
I can speak with that a little bit, and maybe I'll speak a little bit about the agency too if I have a chance. Just so folks know who they're talking to, this is Michelle, and I'm white, and I'm originally from Iowa. I've lived in Bethel basically my entire adult life, but I'm not from here, and I'm a white person, which means that I'm perpetually, a guest of this region, that I've made my adopted home. And this workshop provided for me, for the first time in the, maybe 14 plus years I'd lived here by the time I attended the first workshop, an understanding of things that I thought, wondered about, mistakes I'd made, things I'd see play out with friends or program participants over and over again, but I couldn't really articulate very well. And the reason the workshop helped me is because I think folks have lots of different definitions for what racism is. And the People's Institute, when they bring together, and one thing that they really do an excellent job with is providing a definition that everyone in the room is part of your sort of contract for attending. You agree through the workshop that when you talk about racism, you're talking about it in the context of, in a particular context. And it's an institutional context. And at long last, I was finally able to clearly understand and clearly talk to people about this issue and not have to wonder like why I walk into work every day and I'm a white person who's the director and how did that happen? Because I think white people without us having without being educated, because we're not educated very well on this issue at all, if at all, we're left to our own devices to make our own conclusions. And so for me, we get left with these messages like you get this position because you work really hard. And that there's a lot of subtle messaging to that. What does that mean about, other people who don't have this position or, those kinds of things. And I was finally able to look at this not just from a personal level, although it is very personal, but from an institutional level about who gets access to education, who gets access to opportunities, and why. And so it was, this workshop is at times very painful and very personal, but it also was, and it sounds sort of strange, and I hope folks kind of understand me when I say it, but it was almost a relief in that I was struggling so hard to figure out or understand certain things that I was seeing, thinking, feeling, or observing, and I finally had a terminology for it and a group of people that I could talk about it with that common understanding and definition. And I really appreciated that because I think that I had for years had little pieces or little parts, but truly been left sort of to my own wondering. And if you wonder about something and you come to conclusions, they may or may not be the right conclusions. And so it's provided me a huge opportunity to examine anything from my family's history to how I'm in this position to how do I make decisions and I mean everything. So very personal and professional, many personal and professional. I don't know what the right word is. Impacts. Okay, that's my 2 cents.
Cheryl, did you want to share about what you feel like you personally took away from the Undoing Racism workshops?
Sure. Well, I'm still taking personal things away, even though I haven't been to one for a while. But one of the things, because my dad is white and my mom is Yupik, and so just coming to understand, because for a long time I thought that it didn't matter, what I was. I just had to, like Michelle was saying, work hard and do all these things the right way, and I would get to where I needed to go or wanted to go. But there are always these little barriers and sometimes big barriers along the way, as there are for a lot of people. But now, after going through the workshop, understanding that some of those barriers were racially implemented, not maybe by the person who was or the people who were doing it to me, but by the history of that agency or the history of that place and the rules they had set up long before either myself or the people that I was trying to work around or even born maybe. But understanding how I got either around those or through those, coming from a white father who had the same understanding, kind of as Michelle was saying, that you work hard and you deserve that. And so him seeing me as his daughter and knowing that I deserved to get into a certain class in high school and or things like that, where I was being told I couldn't be in that class, and him fighting for me to get there and kind of opening the door and making sure I got access, where if he wasn't around I probably wouldn't. And for some of my cousins and friends who both their parents were Yupik or Native, maybe didn't get that. And seeing like how they had to get, the other ways they had to get access, or maybe they didn't get access at all. And so just kind of understanding how I got to do some of the things I got to do, and some of the things I didn't get to do, and why. And that, like, part of it is a relief that maybe it wasn't all my fault, and but not blaming. I mean, I don't blame anybody, but just understanding that that's the map that I was walking on, and my map looked different than Michelle's map. And it looks different than my cousin from Togiak's map. And so just knowing that that map exists and what it involves, it just gives you a clear path for yourself, and then, you know, for my daughter, who's going to be looked at as Yupik because her dad is Yupik. And just a simple thing of understanding that if you're, you know, one parent is white and one parent is a person of color, for a long time, you know, I heard people say, and I used to think, well, I could just choose to be whatever I wanted to be. But even though I think I can do that, as I go through this world and all the systems, there aren't people who see me as white. You know, I might appeal to them more because I could act white and connect with my dad's family in ways that would communicate better with a white person or an agency that accepts those values, but that all the agencies and the schools and everything that I have gone through since a child, and even today, I'm not seen as a white person. They might not know that I'm Yupik, but they know that I'm not white. And just knowing that makes things make more sense as you try to work to get what you need and to get what your family needs. And then as far as work, it's helped tremendously because all of my staff have been through it. And just having them know and know what it is when they see it, and that it's not just, you know, it's not just that person, it's that agency and their policies and how they have been trained or taught to see things. One instance just happened the other day is there's a Native foster family who's going to adopt a couple children. They were looking into that home placing another child, and, you know, the worker was not really complaining, but just concerned that to one of my workers that there wasn't enough furniture in the house. It was very sparse, and she was concerned that the children weren't being disciplined. They weren't getting any timeouts, and they weren't getting any, you know, consequences, and that she didn't think that foster mother was, I don't know, like engaged in talking to the children enough. But for my worker and for myself, that was, I mean, that's how it's supposed to be. And, you know, I have cousins in Iowa. My dad is from Iowa too. I have cousins in Iowa who have had children, and I've seen how they've raised their children, and they turn out great. But it's not how I'm raising my daughter. And you know, the mother in Iowa, my cousin, and how she I don't know what it's called now, but you know, talks to her when her baby was young in a high voice, and it's loud, and she's doing all these, you know, body movements, and to me that's not normal, and it would have, for my baby, it would have scared her, because that's not how you're supposed. That for us out here in this region, it's not how you're supposed to be interacting with, you know, a young child. And so that social worker, you know, very innocently imposing how she thought these young foster children should be disciplined versus maybe what was really going on, and the discipline that was taking place that was invisible to her, and that she would use that, use that as a judgment for whether or not she should place another child in that home is it's pretty powerful, because it affects everything, not only that home but that child and all the other decisions that worker is going to make in the future. So things like that happen every day.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Cheryl. Michelle, I wanted to give you a chance to, we just have a couple more minutes here, but a chance to kind of talk about how you brought this back to TWC, the Tundra Women's Coalition.
We brought this back in maybe 3 or 4 different ways, but overall I want everyone to know that our work on this will never be done, and we'll never be able to spend enough time on it. Administratively, because we're a relatively small organization, we're able to, in terms of staffing, we were able to send almost all of our full-time staff through the Undoing Racism workshop, and about half of our board has also been through the workshop. And having that level of participation has allowed us to have many meetings on this topic to debrief and to talk about priority areas that we need to examine underneath this lens or this context that we've all been exposed to. Things like, shelter guidelines, or our expectations, or any kind of rules or things like that we have. Why do we have them, and do they fit? Those kinds of critical evaluations of some of our services. We put the question that Carol mentioned earlier about asking why people are poor, and I ask that you not do this at your organization unless you've had an opportunity to go through the workshop. But into our interview questions for potential employees. So just like people are asked to talk about what they think about domestic violence or sexual assault or what causes it, we also ask that question to candidates now. So the board incorporated elements of the workshop about expectations for future leadership in our strategic plan. So we've specifically talked about in our strategic plan the priority of finding a future executive director who more appropriately reflects our program participants, who are primarily Yupik, Chupik, some Athabascan, and it's important that the leadership here reflects that. So staff meetings, employee screening, strategic plan, and then I think that there is a tremendous value, aside from all of that, in the staff being able to communicate with each other about the work that we're doing, using common language and using this framework. In everyday discussions about participants and like the things that they're trying to access and the barriers that folks face when trying to access systems that were supposedly designed to help them, we're able to talk about all of these barriers using this framework. Even talking about barrier crimes for employment. Certain funds come from certain agencies that say that if employees have committed certain barrier crimes in the past, they can't be hired. And most of you are probably fairly familiar with this. And in a certain context, it sounds like a good idea. But we also know that people of color are disproportionately convicted of crimes. And so what does that mean in this bigger picture lens of institutionalized racism? And that we now know that we have a group of folks who are excluded from certain positions, despite perhaps changing behaviors because of past history. But we know that those are the people who are going to be convicted of those crimes just by basis of color, of race. So having that framework to talk about these issues every day has been probably the most important thing for our agency.
Thanks, Michelle. I think you answered Susie's question there, too. So, Cheryl, do you have any final closing that you want to share with the group before we sign off?
Well, I think if anyone is planning a training or a workshop, that I think it's one that's worthwhile. And if you have any questions, they're always welcome to call me and maybe Michelle. And there are also other agencies who have supported this training across the state. And so you could ask them to. But I would say one of the things I think that's important here is that my department and even my agency and the other partnering agencies, I think, have all committed to kind of keep the Undoing Racism workshops going and figuring out how to keep bringing them back and ways to keep the discussion and the work moving forward, because it's easy to not have enough time to do that, but I think there's enough people that are willing to work towards that. So.
Well, I want to thank both of you and Anne too, and for everyone's patience as we figure out this platform. But it's really interesting to hear your work. I've broadcasted your email now, Cheryl, so people may contact you about the work that you're doing. Anne, did you have any closing thoughts?
No, I just want to thank Cheryl and Michelle for their work in this area. It was really wonderful to learn more about it, and I appreciate your time.
And there will be a link with all of the slides and this recording online if people want to access it later. So, and thanks to everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. Please stand by.